everyone and welcome back to the video. Up this week, as voted for by our channel members, we explore the isolated eerie ruins sitting in the wild and remote hills of the Liddesdale, between Scotland and England. The lands in which this castle sit were once the hotspot and the heart of the Middle March, which were once known as the bloodiest valley in Britain. This castle has a reputation for being haunted by folklore tales and soaks itself inside the mighty stone walls of its turbulent history, full of murder, mystery, treason and intrigue. So join us as we discover the site of Hermitage Castle. For most of its 400-year existence, the castle here at Hermitage was the key to controlling the Scottish Middle March. It was often fought over time and time again. Even its building brought Scotland and England to the brink of war. Hermitage Castle may not be the largest or the finest castle in Scotland, but it is without question one of the most intimidating. After all, it needed to be. Guarding the bloodiest valley in Britain, the castle stood at the centre of a constant cross-border and internal warfare along the Scottish-English border, a cycle that forged in blood the identities of many border families on both sides, such as the Elliots, the Scots and the Douglases. I love the shape in which this castle takes. The property belonged to the de Akers, who had a stronghold here in the 13th century, but it then passed to the de Saules family, who strengthened the castle. One of the family members, named William de Saules, was said to be a man of bad reputation, and is said to have been also practising witchcraft. Many local children were reputably seized by de Saules and never seen again. Neither Scots nor English law held much sway in the borders, with infamous bands of reivers, best thought of as river pirates, wreaking havoc wherever they went. Reiving reached its height in the 16th century, and many captured reivers were weakened in Hermitage Castle's pit prison. The brutality of the reivers was quite shocking. They often were involved in cattle rustling, feuding, murder, arson and pillaging, which were all common occurrences. In 1338, the Englishman Sir Ralph de Neville was besieged by Sir William Douglas, the Knight of Liddesdale, known as the Flower of Chivalry. The oldest parts of the current castle date to around this time, and have much more in common with castles in northern England than with any present Scottish design. Douglas really wanted the important post of sheriff, but there was a rival for the position in the person of Sir Alexander Ramsay. Douglas was outraged and seized his rival and threw him into the pit prison, where he starved to death. Legend has it that he survived for a very short time, whilst eating the grains and the crumbs that fell down through the floorboards. A cruel and nasty way to go. But Douglas himself was to meet a violent end when in 1353 he was murdered by his own godson. His successor was an Englishman, Hugh de Acre. De Acre's successor was William, the first Earl of Douglas, and it is to him that we owe much of the castle that we see today. Later in the 1390s, the third Earl of Douglas added huge corner towers to the defences. The castle was very much built for defence and certainly not for comfort. The Douglas family gained in power and influence over the ensuing century, which raised suspicion. So King James IV ordered the Douglases to trade Hermitage for estates close to Glasgow, and the castle came into the hands of the Hepburn family. One of the most famous of the Hepburns is responsible for the most intensely remembered event in the castle's long and stormy history. In 1566, the owner of Hermitage Castle was James Hepburn, better known as the 4th Earl of Bothwell. Bothwell had enormous influence at the Scottish court of Mary, the Queen of Scots, and was almost certainly the Queen's secret lover. But in October of 1566, the Earl was wounded in a skirmish with the brutal border reivers and was carried to his castle to recuperate. When the Queen heard the news, she hastily set from Jedburgh with her entourage on a wild ride to be at Hepburn's side. It was probably the worst choice she could have made politically, but Mary didn't care for that. She wanted to make sure her secret lover was okay. Her ride covered 25 miles through isolated and wild landscape, but just to spend only 2 hours with the Earl. On her return ride home, she took a fall from her horse into the marsh, which is now called the Queen's Mire, and contracted a fever from which she almost died. The fallout from Mary's escapade was to turn many of her supporters against her, and that was to only escalate when she married Bothwell the following year, shortly after the murder of her second husband, Lord Darnley, a murder in which Bothwell was heavily mixed up in. Finally, after changing hands through various families and earls, the castle was granted to Sir Walter Scott, who was a notorious border reiver, the warden of the Western Marches, keeper of Leadersdale, and the leader of the daring and infamous attack on Carlisle Castle to rescue Willie Armstrong of Kinmont. In 1603, though, the castle became obsolete after the union of the crowns. A similar story with the castle falling into disrepair and decline, so it was handed on to the Historic Scotland, who, like you can see in today's visit, regularly repair and care for the property, so they were able to enjoy the ruins. The structure of the castle started with the building of a rectangular house, which was at least 3 stories high. The upper of the 2 floors comprised of 2 halls, complete with small chambers at their eastern ends. Towers were added to 3 of the 4 corners, which provided living chambers at the upper levels, with a prison and a second well underneath. When the Douglases remodelled the castle, the courtyard and the cellars of the Diacre residence were converted into a 3-cellar storage area. The floors added above the cellar housed 2 halls, but one just above the other. There are now narrow window slits in the lower hall that might suggest that this was more a common hall where the household ate, and a small chamber to its east would have been used by the castle's constable, who would control the access in and out of the castle, and of course they would have been in close proximity to the prison pit and the portcullis machinery over the postern gate. The tower at the northeast corner was home to the castle's prison pit. This tower was made up into rankings for whether prisoners would go to meet their demise. The prisoners of higher status were put into the first floor room, with access to a latrine when needed and some daylight, and the lower status and evil reivers would end up on the ground floor level, which was a grim pit prison, sheltered from any light, air or sanitation. It was a horrible way to go. Finally, the building was built for strength, not to look pretty, so it had very few windows in place, and this made the openings around the top of the castle even more striking. It's interesting that they were doors that once led onto a wooden fighting platform that ran around the entire building. The platform was supported by timber joists and fitted into square sockets in the walls just below the openings and resting on the projected corbels. It was the ideal line of attack to protect from enemy invasions. This is not only brilliant to imagine when defending their castle, but it's such an intimidating look, and it's quite unique to Hermitage. In the southeast corner is a tower that housed the well. In a time when there was conflict and peaceful times, it was always clever to be armed with essential provisions, and the well chamber was one of them, in the potential of lengthy sieges. The well chamber also had a postern entrance, which we saw as we came into view of the castle, but it's since been blocked up. The location of the well near the postern can suggest that this entrance was not only used by those inside the castle, but also from the staff working outside. On the second floor was a private chamber with a latrine, closet, partially projecting out onto corbels. Perhaps the most grandest and most regal part of the castle was the Douglas Tower, the largest of the 4 towers to stand, more than likely used by the Earl and his family when they were living here. The upper floors would have held the finest chambers in all of the castle. This was the place to be, filled with large fireplaces and generous windows to gaze from, and ensuite latrines built for their comfort. It was more than likely that the wounded 4th Earl of Bothwell would have stayed here whilst Mary came to his aid for a few hours, and they would have been in the best of rooms at the castle. The ground floor was where the kitchen once was. It was separated from the entrance passage by a wall that has since disappeared. We're still able to glance at the remains of the large fireplaces that would have been used for cooking, but now missing its stone canopy. With Hermitage Castle being such an ominous place, it is bound to have suitably dark tales that surround it. Whilst we wander around inside the now empty rooms of the fantastic remains, let me tell you some of the stories that spook this castle. One of my favourites is the folklore tale of Robin the Redcap. According to the legend, Lord Soulis was a cruel and wicked tyrant. He was a wizard and a specialist of the black arts. He is said to have fortified his castle by all available means, using both materials and infernal spells, and received advice from his familiar and henchman, Robin the Redcap. Redcaps are also known as nasty dwarves, and are said to be a breed of evil goblins with a lust for blood. They mostly inhabit the ruined castles along the border between England and Scotland, where they murder and desire after their travellers, to dye their hats with their victims' blood. The Redcap must kill on a regular basis, so that the blood on its hat doesn't dry out. If the blood runs dry, the Redcap will die. They were incredibly fast, and in spite of the heavy iron pikes and iron-shod boots that they wore, outrunning a Redcap is said to be impossible. They were normally depicted as sturdy old men with red eyes. The Redcaps have taloned hands and large teeth. They are known to bear the pike staff in their left hand for hunting wandering and lost travellers, never to be seen again. The castle itself would be guarded by the Redcap, whilst his master was inside playing with black magic and witchcraft. The Lord would use his powers to summon up spirits and torture the victims caught by his monstrous servant, Robin. Lord Soulis could not be killed by metal weapons or any kind of equipment. No arrows, bolts or swords could do the job, but he was eventually defeated at the orders of the King of Scotland. He was defeated by being bound and captured by the King's army, who had taken him off to Ninestane Rig, which was a nearby stone circle just a few miles away, and boiled him in lead to kill him. Even with the Lord gone, Robin Redcap is said to still be seen at Hermitage Castle, guarding his treasure. And Lord Soulis's ghost is also supposed to return every 7th year to the vaults in which he sacrificed his victims. His terrifying phantom and the frightful screams of his innocent victims have been heard on more than one occasion. Sadly, putting this tale aside, William was actually arrested for treason against Robert the Bruce, and died as a prisoner in Dumbarton Castle. But legend often overrules factual evidence, because who doesn't love a good story or a tale? Just a quarter of a mile away are the remains of a chapel inside its graveyard. The chapel has a simple rectangle plan, and appears to date from the late 1200s to the early 1300s. It was more than likely the chapel that served the de Saulles' first residence here at Hermitage. Pretty ruinous and empty, but a reminder still of its history. The walls at the castle overpower and tower above you. It makes quite the intimidating stance, and it doesn't feel welcome at all. Yet once you step inside the weathered remains, you'll be amazed at the awe-inspiring views hidden inside this castle. There really is something quite sinister yet romantic about Hermitage that makes for such a great explore, even better with its location as it's quite isolated, So that's it for this week. We hope that you've enjoyed exploring Hermitage Castle as much as we have. If you have, please be sure to hit that like button. Consider subscribing to the channel or supporting us through our links over on Patreon, or join discussions, polls and have your say in what we do next if you join our YouTube members. We want to say a big thank you to everyone for watching, so we'll see you in the next one. Till next time.